Hi, everyone. My name's Kevin Maroney. I work at Internet2. I head up the Net Plus Cloud Services Division and also what we call the Trust and Identity Division. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Welcome to the eduroam in the Cloud, Enabling the Next 1,000 Subscribers webinar. Some of you Zoom veterans will note that we're recording today's webinar. The recording and the slides will be posted on the InCommon.org website as fast as we're able to manage it after today's webinar. Again, for folks who are familiar with Zoom, hopefully you are by now. We'd ask that if you have questions to ask them in the chat window during the presentation, and I'll curate them either within the flow of our panelists today, and if we have time at the end, I'll try to package them all together so we can get most, if not all of your questions attended to today. And so if we could get to the next slide. So here are our speakers today. I'm joined by two of my Internet2 colleagues, Sarah Jeans and Rami Bolton. And we're also joined by a dear colleague and partner these last few years on eduroam, Jeff Egley from the Utah Education and Telehealth Network organization. I'll let them all briefly introduce themselves as they dig into the material. Next slide, please. And here's what our panelists, Jeff, Rami, and Sarah will be covering today. The motivations for moving eduroam's infrastructures, the principles of the new UI. I'm assuming most of you are eduroam subscribers. Carly, if you could throw up the poll that we have here to help today's panelists. Just like to ask you to very quickly indicate to us if you've already deployed eduroam, thinking about it, or you're here to learn about it because you're considering something about eduroam. So looks like almost all of you have deployed eduroam, and just a handful or so are in the thinking about buying. So thank you so much, Carly, and thank you to the participants for giving us that that insight. It'll help. The panelists are also going to go into the technical design and something near and dear to my heart, how we communicated this to the eduroam community and what we learned. And look forward to your questions throughout. So with that, I'm going to go on mute and hand it over to Jeff. Jeff?
Thank you, Kevin. I'm Jeff Egley. I'm an associate director with the Utah Education and Telehealth Network. Really excited to be asked to participate in today's discussion. It's very near and dear to my heart. I am the current eduroam advisory committee chair. I believe we're in our fourth year of this, so a fairly young committee. I also participate with Internet2's support organization. UETN was the first support organization to jump in and start working to increase access to eduroam into K-12, and with that comes I'm also the program manager here at UETN for eduroam. Next slide, Sarah. Some of the things that we're doing here within the advisory is one of the first efforts is we pushed out a white paper on best practices. Some of the current work that's going on are recommendations you'll see coming on onboarding recommendations and also guest access. As you can see from the slide, we've got a great group that contributes to the EAC. I'm fortunate to be included and be part of that. There's some good work going on, and we're able to focus on some of the things that are kind of new to eduroam and as it's brought in by the support organization. So as we look at how we support and connect K-12, and then something else that we were heavily involved in and Internet2 is now supporting, and that's the SPs, and we work very heavily to bring on SPs, including state and local government, and the private sector, and mass transit and things of that nature. So this has been a great process and allows us to bring some of these things forward too into into the EAC. Next slide, Sarah. So as today's discussion will illustrate, we're looking, how do you bring on those next 1,000 subscribers? We're seeing a lot of growth. A lot of that growth and a lot of those current subscribers are higher education. But as we will discuss here now with the support organization program, we're working with regional networks to start bringing on K-12 on a statewide basis, or in some cases on a more localized basis with what's considering a new on-ramp option for eduroam. And as you can see how some of this works as it's laid out, we have our support organizations then really working within our communities, within our networks as a support mechanism, and how we maintain this network and these expanded services into these new subscribers. Next slide. So right now we have Youth Education and Telehealth Network heavily involved as a support organization. We were excited to see Connected Nebraska and the Sun Corridor come on board. Connected Nebraska is well into extending service throughout the state of Nebraska. Sun Corridor is working on their program in Arizona. And the nice benefit is as these organizations push out eduroam, we're learning a lot from one another and gaining that benefit and being able to share back and forth on how we are bringing on SPs, how are we managing our support, how do we participate in the community in conferences and provide access. Successes that we have within SPs. Connected Nebraska, for example, is doing very well within the private sector with SPs, and Utah is very involved with state and local government right now, and really trying to take a page from Connected Nebraska on how we get into that private sector for SP access. And now, just recently announced, we have CEN and Link Oregon starting the new cohort this year. So this is terrific. Two organizations that are really well situated to push forward with eduroam in CEN's case and with Connecticut, really very well established throughout the state. I believe we'll gain a lot and learn a lot from them, and we have a lot to offer them as they grow their program. And then Link Oregon has been tracking this whole effort on the support organizations for some time. They're doing the on-ramp option, which allows them to jump in with, I believe, up to 5 IDPs and really kind of develop that, bring those on, use that as a mechanism to really organize and understand how they will support eduroam when they go to expand it on a statewide basis within Oregon. So very excited to see these two new come on. We'll be working along with Connected Nebraska and Sun Corridor to support them and help ensure their success. And looking forward to today's discussion and the questions you may have about both Internet2's progress forward with eduroam and anything you may have regarding the support organization. So thanks so much. I think the next slide is yours.
Yeah, and thank you, Jeff. I realized we somehow left off Sun Corridor's logo off this slide. So shout out to them and the work they're doing in Yuma and Pinal counties there in Arizona. So thanks, Jeff, and really appreciate that framing. So I'm here to with my colleague, Rami Bolton. We're both with Internet2. And we're here to dig into some of the details. I've been getting a fair number of questions from folks, especially who have been following the progress and the migration over the last year about, where are the details? How did things go? How did things work? Where are you going? So we hope that this session today starts to dig into some of those details, but as always, go ahead and put any questions you have in the chat, or reach out to the list. The list is a pretty active place to have conversations, and Rami and I will chat about that in a bit. So just a bit of framing on the service. eduroam is a great service that's available around the world. It lets us roam on various educational organizations, primarily in universities around the world. But as Jeff was talking about, we're seeing the expansion of eduroam into a whole bunch of interesting and unique places, especially throughout Utah in particular. That big 590 red spot is highlighting all of the great work that the team at Utah has done. But it's also about being able to onboard users and be able to connect in a secure way, in a privacy preserving way, and making sure that folks can onboard and access resources wherever they are without overly disclosing details. The other thing I want to highlight here is that we always tend to trim US maps in a way that doesn't show the whole breadth of what we're really talking about here. And there you can find eduroam in the farthest reaches of Alaska, all the way down to Puerto Rico and Hawaii, all the way out to Guam as well. So wherever you are in the US, you're likely to encounter eduroam. How big is eduroam in the US? This is a global service, but I'm going to focus on, and we're really going to kind of focus on the US instance of eduroam today. There are, we're quickly approaching that 3,000 locations number, which is a pretty big milestone there. Almost 1,000 organizations that are providing identities that can be logged in with, and then subscribers of service. Just over, you probably saw our blog post, we're just over about 1,000 subscribers to the service. So it has a really big presence. So it's really appropriate for us to be thinking, as we hit that 1,000 subscriber milestone, what does that next 1,000 look like? And what we're finding, and after this conversation we've had with you all and with the broader community, both in kind of the traditional Internet2 eduroam spaces around higher education, but also in these other constituencies, there's really a twofold need. It's really about including others in this conversation. And you saw with our participation in the eduroam advisory committee that this is really a broader conversation. It's higher education, but it's also many other folks, in particular primary, secondary schools, K-12, and increasingly libraries, museums, and others as we work with Jeff and his colleagues throughout the support organizations. And what this means is we really need to enable greater scalability and kind of a greater understanding of the service, not just about roaming, but also about the security considerations and how we begin introducing this service to folks who maybe wear multiple different hats. Maybe they're the gym teacher or the biology teacher at their schools. Maybe they're working with folks who in, say, education support agencies, which are kind of groups of collective IT folks that help support scaling technology for K-12 within states. And not all of these folks have kind of the same skill sets we traditionally expect of a wireless administrator or someone managing thousands of access points on a university or on a campus. So making sure that we're thinking about how this service increasingly becomes available to more folks and increasingly able to be administered by more folks as well. So after those conversations, where did we go with that? Kind of the next phase in that conversation is really in designing the service. So taking those core principles and then trying to apply them to some specific techniques. So when we talk about scale, Internet2 and the broader community has a fair amount of experience in cloud, so that felt like a pretty natural next step. And I'll dig into some of the details a bit later. And really thinking about how we incorporate some of those goals and principles in the service. And with that, Rami and I are going to trade back and forth a bit as we walk through this process. So Rami, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. As Kevin and Sarah both said, I work at Internet2. I'm a project manager, and we're going to trade back and forth on these slides because that's pretty much how the project went, is back and forth between us and a cast of thousands. So I've been a project manager for quite a while. Like a lot of folks at Internet2, I spent a long time on a campus, and I've done lots of moves and migrations, and I came to realize early on that as important as a move and migration is to me, it's very rarely important to the people that are moving and migrating. So it was important to us that we spend a lot of time designing a process to move folks to this new infrastructure that was as easy as possible for them. We had a few things working for us and against us. One of those things was the fact that eduroam is super solid, right? It just runs. People spend, they come in every day, eduroam runs, they're not logging into the console as frequently as you might be with some other applications. And so we knew that we needed to establish communication with folks right off the bat. As I said, we also knew that this move wasn't as important to others as it is to us. So it was important to us that there were no day of activities that had to happen on a campus, university, college, K-12 school, wherever it was, that this was able to happen without any action on their part. And then that the move itself was just pretty straightforward. Very little disruption. We didn't want it. So these were all of the principles that we used kind of going forward. All right, next slide, Sarah, please. So this was the overall timeline for the project. It started in the fall of 2020, as both Jeff and Sarah talked about, with the community requirements process. So we spent a long time talking with the community, seeing what they would like, what they thought, explaining the direction that we thought eduroam was going. We created a white paper based on that we presented to the EAC. Spring 21, we updated the design. We'd been working in the background on some design principles and updated that to coalesce with what the community was asking for. And we started full testing documentation in the fall, and then the winter timeframe was when we made all of the moves. All right, next slide, Sarah. So what did we do and why? What was significant about this? It was a lift by any measure. So there was a lot going on. We simultaneously merged the existing admin console with our existing federation manager, the InCommon Federation Manager. We felt like having those applications together would create some positives for the community. Simultaneously, we had to move the Federation Manager itself to AWS. We built out a radius proxy, and then finally we built all of the connective pieces to hook all of those things together. From a data perspective, our existing subscribers, we took a full data set one time and then just used daily deltas to keep up. And that was one of the things that was working for us, with the fact that eduroam just runs and people don't have to interface with the console frequently. We were able to keep up pretty easily with using daily deltas. We added in IAM tools for authentication. The move itself, we had really November 1st to December 1st to get it all done. You lose a week in there for Thanksgiving, and then winter break on campuses. We were trying to avoid that. So we did 100 to 600 on every Tuesday and Thursday. We lumped them together based on were they near each other, maybe collegiate conference affiliation, state systems. The other thing that was important to us was to allow people to choose their move date. We've all been on campuses. You are all on campuses with organizations, and things are happening on campuses that we're not aware of. So there may be a Board of Regents visit. There might be a big student activity happening. So we allowed, via the wiki that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, we allowed organizations to come in and choose a date in that November 1st to December 1st timeframe. And so at the end of it all, it moved pretty smoothly. And now I'm going to turn things back over to Sarah for a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Rami. So beginning to dig into a bit of the technical details, there were a number of kind of pieces we needed to fit together. There were some core principles in the technology space that we really wanted to focus on. So we're a community organization. First and foremost, we wanted to make sure we were using open source technologies wherever possible. I recognize that Amazon isn't fully open source, but it's generally a really strong platform to build upon, and there's a lot of great community resources around it. And so we use that as a base, and then as the software layered on, we stuck to open source wherever possible. So in particular, the service is built on FreeRadius as the Radius backend for the national routing. So when we receive requests from you all and need to connect you all to each other, it's all done through FreeRadius. And then we also built upon Grafana and Loki, which are two open source projects that let us both collect logs and aggregate them to individual subscribers, as well as then display them out as well. The way we kind of stepped through this cadence was based around a series of reviews with folks. Jeff and Rami both mentioned our exercises with the eduroam advisory committee. We also did a number of technical kind of deep diving exercises and reviewing different designs and kind of working through proof of concepts and trying to figure out how the pieces should really fit together as well. And there were some core principles that really fell out of this. So making sure things were well documented, trying to do our best to follow DevOps principles, making sure things are well documented, but also documented well in code, checking in all of not only the software and the software versioning, but also the infrastructure code was really important to the team so that it was highly portable, and that's come in handy a number of times as we've worked through iterating on the infrastructure. And then also following some of these core principles around making sure it's highly available. We're a pretty small team, and we recognize that you will rely a lot on the eduroam infrastructure, so trying to make sure it was as highly available as reasonably possible, but that there are a number of kind of internal teams working on the different components. So trying to make sure that they were loosely coupled enough where the team working on a federation manager could push updates and revisions to their software independent of the team working on the back end. So from a high level conversation, this is ultimately kind of what the infrastructure looks like, and I'll continue to dig into a bit of details. But conceptually, where we started off with was, as Kevin mentioned, kind of the front end pieces and the back end pieces. So there is kind of a big capability that needs to happen to make sure all of the requests for eduroam get routed properly, and that needs to be highly scalable and highly available. And that's labeled here as the eduroam US infrastructure. And then there needs to be a way for eduroam administrators, probably many people on this call, to be able to pop in pretty easily, but frankly, very occasionally, and modify different pieces or make some changes, and then make sure those get propagated to the back. We're very conscious that, as Rami pointed out, the pieces of the service tend to generally run, or if you're making modifications to the service, you typically do them on your campus or at your hotspot location, and not necessarily at the national level as well. So making sure that it was relatively straightforward to get in to eduroam Federation Manager, make those changes, and the interface makes sense and it generally works was a key item in this design as well. You'll also note that in the infrastructure pieces, we're really thinking about how folks are using the service, because individual transactions are moving through the service for the user to log on. Generally, it's not something you notice, but we found that the service is actually pretty sensitive to whether or not you have folks log in on the West Coast of the US or the East Coast of the US if you're in the US. And that's something kind of to be aware of, and maybe even something for future conversations with folks, that the geographic difference, the speed of light is real, and the US is big enough where you actually end up starting to notice in the eduroam service.
I'm gonna as soon as you said the speed of light is real, it gives me an opportunity to call out John D's question about access to authentication logs and any plans for an API to help develop local support processes.
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's something we've heard from a couple of folks before. I do think that Grafana and Loki being open source and being kind of readily available with APIs may facilitate that. The current focus has largely been on trying to make sure we get existing functionality in place. So we kind of have a punch list of items that we're frankly still working on, and I'll talk to a bit, that we wanted to work through first. But that's a really great suggestion. I've heard it from a couple of people, and it's probably something we should look at in the future as maybe something we look to deploy.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Noel has a comment and a question that believes that eduroam started in Europe, and you're indeed right, it did indeed start there. And in fact, in many ways, we have lagged in the US in terms of, well, it's hard to say because we're so big, right, compared to some of the European nations. But with the advent of the eduroam support organization program, we're kind of in this explosive phase now. So it's kind of exciting to be in the US and be connected to eduroam. Noel's question is, do these changes affect any authentications overseas?
Yep, the shorter answer is no. Well, we worked with the Europeans to make sure that was kind of smooth and seamless. The slightly longer answer is that eduroam is, at least in the US in particular, and generally speaking around the world, is deployed hierarchically today. So basically the national servers are checking for any authentications that might need to be routed into the US. And if we don't see those folks on the list, we send them northbound. We send them, in fact, to Europe to do those authentications to let folks flow through. So both US users looking to authenticate or get on eduroam elsewhere in the world, or international folks coming to the US and looking to arrive and get connectivity, those flows look the same as they did before. We kind of just swapped one infrastructure out for the other.
And since we're on a Q&A roll at the moment, let's clear the queue here. So Hunter's asked, is there any correlation with the TLRS1/S2 IP addresses and West-East, or are both servers really cloud load balancers that could send requests to either coast?
Yes and yes. So that's a great question. And I'm going to click to my next slide and then the following slide, because I'll be able to answer that as we talk through this. But essentially, yes, there is, for historic reasons and for kind of migration reasons, there is kind of a coastal correlation between TLRS1 and TLRS2. Rami can check me on this. I'm almost positive that TLRS1 is East Coast and TLRS2 is West Coast.
Yes.
Those used to be, thanks, Rami. Those used to be physical servers. So there was literally a server sitting on the East Coast and on the West Coast that would field those. So it was tough to be able to load balance those. I think where we're trending is likely towards some sort of load balancing, but as I'll speak to, there are some interesting challenges in trying to make sure that that traffic is kind of routed and load balanced correctly. So Radius is pretty old. It uses UDP. We're kind of getting way into the network details here, but it uses UDP instead of TCP. So moving UDP traffic to the cloud, especially if we want to make sure we support folks on IPv6, proves some really interesting challenges. So we had originally, as I'm showing on the screen here, we had originally designed what we thought was going to be a pretty straightforward, it's going to the cloud, it's going to be a fairly elastic backend, and folks will come in, will load balance the traffic. It's the cloud, you don't really need to know where the connectivity is going. and we'll just make it happen and then kind of send the traffic around. And kind of off of that, we'll hang logging, we'll hang, monitoring off of it, some of the server configuration. And this was kind of our initial design diagram for what that might look like. Well, it turns out that that design diagram gets really complex really fast and is particularly difficult to translate to the cloud. So where we are today, and after our testing, realized that it may make sense, and it did make sense, at least in the interim, to still have those traffics have geographic locations. So there's a lot less of a presence in those data centers in the East and the West Coast, but they still are today. And when I flag up the maintenance notices, I would expect in the future you'll likely see less, hey, you might see a blip on the network today than you might in the future, but that's because we actually are pulling that traffic still back through the same place we did before in the East Coast and West Coast. So that was a bit of a long explanation, but TLRS-1 and TLRS-2 are largely virtual now, but they still do have a bit of geographic affinity. Were you looking to jump in, Rami?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, definitely, Hunter. Always happy to. So this is kind of what it looks like today. We are using the scaling of the cloud, but still maintain the geographic affinity. That may change, like I said, in the short-ish, medium-ish term, but we're still looking at all the details and don't want to do anything particularly major until we kind of test it out quite thoroughly. So what we're doing today is we're pulling that traffic through basically an Ubuntu VM that sits one East Coast, one West Coast. It fields that traffic, and it's the one advertising the IP address for TLRS-1, TLRS-2, which is an interesting and different rabbit hole to run down that we could if folks are interested in talking about it. But it's advertising a specific single IP address and that namespace. And then we're taking that traffic, we're kind of checking that traffic a bit for what it looks like, and then pulling it to the cloud from there. Internet2, our data centers, our connectivity really has great capacity to the cloud. And the vast majority of folks connect internet to eduroam over the Internet2 network. So there's a lot of, to overuse a buzzy term, there's a lot of synergies here with you all leveraging the Internet2 network and how the traffic is flowing here as well. But we're basically pulling that traffic to the cloud. That's on the other side of that VPN tunnel, then fields that traffic, and then we kind of do more of the cloud hand waving, load balancing as well in that way. Currently, as I showed on the prior diagram, we currently have presence in 2 US East and 2 US West data centers, and then we have some more flexibility across availability zones as well. So really trying to make use of the scaling. This is an architecture we think will scale quite a ways yet, but also thinking about, okay, at what point does it make sense for that front door to move to the cloud? And when do we start deriving some significant scaling benefits from that? But still some proof of concepts and some things to work through yet. You can tell I like a lot of these technical pieces here. So we'll move on, and I'll hand it over to Ron just shortly as we move, and right here as we move to, how do we work on hearts and minds, and how do we win people over to helping us with this migration process. So Rami, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, thanks. Yep, absolutely. We're talking about hearts and minds. Sarah covered the bits and bytes, and as a really smart boss I had once told me, hearts and minds are an order of magnitude harder than the bits and bytes when you work in the technology field, and probably everybody here would agree with that. So what did we do? We've talked about this community paper. Again, checking direction regularly. Is this what people want to see? Can we do this? We did some webinars. We had a very extensive wiki on FAQs and exactly what's going to happen in the text of emails. And then the direct contact emails were an important part of this. So we sent one initially early on just to see, is somebody on the other end of this email address? And again, that comes back to that. This is a service that just runs. And we knew that there was potentially some stale data out there with regard to contacts. And then we sent organizations many messages. Are you ready for this? It's going to happen. Hey, it's happening. It's happening tomorrow. Okay, today's the day it's happening. This happened. And so we felt like that was a pretty good cadence to try to keep people in the loop as to what was going on. And then post, I talked about earlier that we did these moves on Tuesdays and Thursdays so support could keep up. That's a lot of what happened in that ongoing contact piece is we were handling those Tuesday and Thursdays, lots of one-on-one Zoom conversations, lots of direct email, lots of get on the phone and talk to each other. And so that was our process for at least keeping people updated and understanding what was going on. All right, next slide. And of course, it wouldn't be a great project if you didn't have some dirty laundry to talk about at the end of it. So we had a multi-hour retrospective, and these are some of the things that came out of that I want to share with everybody. First one, data. It's always good to keep your data clean, not stale. We ran into that on many occasions. So we're definitely looking at ways to prompt people on data checks, make sure we have the right number of contacts. We also identified that we may need to go through a best practice kind of effort. The EAC, they published a document best practices guide for eduroam. And that's something that we will probably get out and talk with people about. These are some ways to ensure that your eduroam account access is in line. Extra eyes on the designs and plans really helped. I can't tell you the number of times we made course corrections. And so having all of those individuals being able to give feedback, having our EAC colleagues looking at things, making sure we were on the right track. And again, back to, I keep saying eduroam is a solid service. So it can sometimes be hard to convince people that when something just works and it's solid and they don't see anything wrong, that it needs to change. So we spent a lot of time on talking about this presentation. Why do we need to change? Where are those next 1,000 coming from? Who are they? Why are they coming? And then being able to add in some benefits to the existing eduroam users. We added IAM tools for authentication. It was the right thing to do, but it definitely added complexity to adoption. And so we're still working through some of those issues, but it was in the end the right thing to do. It was important to keep a tight grip on the scope of the project, and we all know that. But in this particular project, because we were close, we weren't cutting edge, but we were close to cutting edge in some things that it was important for us to keep a tight scope on the actual solution and not look down the road too far at something that wasn't quite ready yet. And then the final lesson we learned was you can't over communicate. Communicate until they tell you that you've communicated too much, and then you probably did it about right. All right. Back to Sarah.
Thanks, Rami. So as we talk about a retrospective about the migration process, there's tons of work that's been done. You all have done tons of work, and the EAC has had countless conversations about the migration. You might have heard me talking about the concept of parity at scale, or that what we're really looking to do is try and get to the functionality that was in the older console, but also make sure that it can support the next 1,000 subscribers of the service. And frankly, that work continues. We have a number of things we walked through. The timing of this webinar and this session was because we were continuing to add additional features, and we've updated various groups along the way, whether it's the EAC or support organizations, around the kinds of things we're working on and continue to add. We're getting pretty close to having parity at scale. We're almost there. But I wanted to highlight a couple of the features that were released over the last few months as we continue to work on delivering this functionality. So if you're following the eduroam admins list, you may have seen some of these updates. I try and keep the folks on that list updated. But in particular, logging, I know, was a big piece of functionality folks wanted. Grafana and Loki using open source tooling is a lot more complex than we expected it might be, and there's a lot under the hood that happens to make sure that you all can see fairly real-time access for both successes and failures, because it's useful to be able to see when your server is trying to send and get connected to eduroam US, but it's sending a bad secret. But also if your help desk is trying to troubleshoot an individual user who isn't able to log in, it's not necessarily a failure of the connection, that's a failure of getting the user connected. So those look different. Getting those as close to real time as possible, and then making sure those are secured in a way that are scoped to each eduroam admin turned out to be super complex in getting those up and running. Another big one, the ability to add your peers in a secure way. Those, as Rami said, getting folks onboarded through a proper kind of login flow and invitation process to invite others in to use a set of federated credentials, if possible, and then fall back to other forms of credentials if not, was pretty complex. And then the most recent one was a feature in particular for support organizations to make sure that they could decommission a subscriber within their space who wasn't currently active or in some other way needs to be decommissioned. It looks like we have a question came in. Testing tools in the future, any testing tools getting very close to the point. So we are very close to having this ready. They are actively being worked on. There's two different flavors of testing tools though. So there's one that's slightly easier to implement and one that's slightly harder to implement at scale. The first one, which the team is actively working on, both the front end team, the team working on the Federation Manager, as well as the back end team, they both have to talk to each other. So making sure that those get up and running. I'm hoping pretty shortly here. I'm going to leave that a little vague, but the teams are actively working it and they're getting very close. The other piece that's slightly more difficult is basically the ability to hand an eduroam administrator a set of credentials that you can take and test your access point with and your hotspot with and make sure that it's functioning correctly and can use eduroam properly. It's a little more difficult to do. We want to make sure things like those credentials are short-lived so that they only work for, say, a few hours before they expire. Making sure it's a valid test so that it's not just testing what's at your location, but also all the way up and back to the national infrastructure to make sure that it's running properly as well. So that's proven to be a bit more complex. And that's something we're working on scoping here, and will be lined up and hopefully a feature set shortly after the IDP testing piece. Excellent, thanks, Hunter. So other pieces we talk a lot about, and I know a lot of the folks on the eduroam admins list tend to skew a technologist. So I tend to update folks a lot on the technology pieces that are in flight, but lots of other stuff the team is doing as well. So, retrospective webinar, we're here today. That's exciting for, I know, the whole team to get to present to you all. Two things that I hear fairly often: the HECVAT, or the Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Tool. It's something that pops up with a lot of vendors, a lot of cloud folks, but eduroam is has a lot of the same kinds of considerations and review pieces that we would want to share with you all. We thought the HECVAT might be a useful format to share those details with, to share those details in that format. So we're working on one. It's pretty close to being ready. We're also doing a VPAT assessment. So hopefully I'm not stepping on anyone's toes, but we expect to do a release on the eduroam front end, on Federation Manager in the next couple of weeks to address some of the items that were raised in a VPAT for accessibility. So it's the voluntary product accessibility template. The team scored really well. Accessibility is always a core component whenever we build a UI or build a front end for folks. but we had a formal assessment done. So there's a couple things the team is working on to make sure that those are cleaned up. So if anyone's familiar with accessibility formats, we're targeting a WCAG 2.0 AA level of accessibility support. So it should be really strong, work really well with screen readers, and have proper tags everywhere, that sort of thing. And then tons of website updates. We've been working with the support orgs on details for getting additional folks to deploy hotspots. So really thinking about how do we communicate about eduroam more? How do we bring more people into the conversational fold? I think we're just about, there's probably 1 or 2 more slides left, and we'll make sure we capture any questions and we can move there. So make sure you get your questions into chat. So I did want to touch on monitoring. We're trying to be really transparent wherever possible when it comes to kind of monitoring and maintenance. Sometimes there is an unexpected or an emergency maintenance, but anytime that we get kind of upfront notices, especially from the Internet2 network teams, that we make sure we post them out. So the team is always actively monitoring the service. We leverage OpsGenie, we leverage Slack, we leverage Nagios to do kind of different types of monitoring and testing of the service. I will, or folks on the Internet2 team will send out notes to the eduroam admins list or to eduroam administrators. In particular, whenever we have maintenances coming up, you can always, if you're more of kind of a pull notification person as opposed to kind of a push, status.incommon.org always has details up. There is some tuning to it. We talk about TLRS1 and TLRS2 independently, which doesn't really, it's their servers, not the service. So we're doing some tuning to make it a bit clear when the service is having an issue, as opposed to just when one or the other of the front end servers is coming down for maintenance. And then as a reminder, this is an inherent way that eduroam is set up today. You really want to be connected to both TLRS1 or top level radius server 1 and top level radius server 2 or TLRS2, because we do maintenance sometimes. So if you want to make sure your connectivity stays up, you'll want to make sure you're connecting to both. And then I think Jeff already touched on this slide. So there are 2 big work items the EAC is working on, and we're always looking for community input, community participation. I'm going to put Jeff out there as the person to reach out to, but always throw it in chat. We'd be happy to reach back out to you, or if you want to reach out to the help email, always happy to chat with folks there. But the 2 big items that the EAC is working on is understanding the challenge around user device onboarding, and really how do we begin to address those requirements in particular. So what are folks using? What kind of tools are folks using? And in particular, how are folks doing it? What are your needs? Are you using certificates? Are you using passwords? And we recognize that, especially as we move into K-12, those conversations take on a whole different complexion, and one-to-one device programs and mobile device management for folks roaming around adds all sorts of other complexities to it. So really trying to understand what a landscape looks like, and hopefully distill those down into individual kind of next items or next questions for the EAC to review and possibly the team to work through. And then the other question, it's been a bit on pause, but is kind of, in sitting next to the user device work as something that the EAC wants to address and take a look at, is guest access. There's a paper out there that went out for public comment late last year, and it's kind of sitting ready for work or further conversation. I don't know, Jeff, did you want to comment on either of those?
I appreciate you just identifying these, and input's appreciated. Input overall for the EAC as well to ensure we're focused on the right priorities. So yeah, we encourage you to reach out or contact me. But no, that was perfect, Sarah. And yeah, we definitely would love to receive input and anything that you believe should be something the EAC needs to focus on. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeff. And that leads us to questions. So, I mean, Anne threw a great question into chat that the EAC has been contemplating for a little while. And great to get feedback from folks on whether or not onboarding. So when we say onboarding, that's getting students or getting your faculty or staff or others properly configured on eduroam in a privacy preserving and a secure way, onboarded, and making sure their devices are configured well and properly. And then the guest space is another interesting one where you have all of these different kinds of flavors of guests. You have folks coming to a campus or another location, maybe for a lacrosse match or a soccer match, and others who have an extended affiliation, maybe that's several days for a conference, several weeks or months for an internship, or even possibly longer than that, maybe vendor partners or others. So some really important questions there. Love folks to jump in on those.
Well, I'm going to still encourage people to throw any questions you might have into the chat window, and I might ask one of my colleagues to throw Sarah's, Rami's, and my email in the chat window as well while I'm trying to wrap up here. So before I bid everyone adieu, again, we put a question and we have time to probably address one or two more questions. So I don't play this card much anymore because I've been at Internet2 for 7 years. Prior to coming to Internet2, I was the Chief Information Officer at Penn State, which is a big public land-grant multi-campus institution with tons of research and a hospital, et cetera. And over the time of both that job and this job, I've done a lot of large-scale change management projects. And this project had at least as much complexity and as many risks as anything I did in that large research university setting with literally tens of millions of people and their access to stuff at stake. So I just want to tip my hat to my colleagues at Internet2, Sarah, Rami, and many, many others. And also Jeff, because our newest advisory body in the trust and identity universe of advising and governance is the eduroam Advisory Committee. And I've never seen an advisory committee get up to speed as quickly as that group did. And it played a critical role in setting a foundation for all these changes. So hats off to all of you. One more question. Oh no, that's a question for Hunter. I'll buy a little time. As a reminder, today's webinar was recorded, and the recording will be soon on the InCommon.org website. So you can review the slides and the recording at InCommon.org in a couple of days or so, and would encourage you to share it with others. And once again, with thanks to our panelists today for a great dive into the latest chapter in this long eduroam story. And thanks to the attendees for coming. Have a great day, everyone.